She walked into the grand Joseon ballroom, and the entire room shifted. Not the way a room shifts when someone beautiful enters, not the slow, admiring turn of heads that follows a woman men want and women study. This was different. This was the particular stillness that falls over a group of people when something has gone wrong in a way that is also, to them, deeply amusing. Every conversation paused at the same moment, as if the air itself had been interrupted. Champagne flutes hovered halfway to lips. A man in a charcoal suit stopped mid-sentence. A woman with diamond studs the size of small moons turned from her companion and looked, really looked, the way people look at something they cannot quite explain. Seo Yeon-ji stood in the doorway of the most expensive room in Seoul and felt the weight of every eye in it land on her body like a physical thing. She was wearing the only formal dress she owned. Navy blue, bought 3 years ago from a clearance rack in Noryangjin Market for 18,000 won. The fabric had held up. She had pressed it herself that afternoon on her mother's old iron, the one with the cracked handle held together with electrical tape. She had done her own makeup in the bathroom mirror of the goshiwon where she had lived for the past 4 years, the one above the pajangmacha on the corner of Heuksok-dong, where the landlord collected rent in cash on the first of every month and never once asked how she was doing. She had told herself she looked fine. The grand Joseon ballroom told her otherwise. It was not the dress. Not exactly. It was everything the dress could not hide, the shoes that were close but not quite right, the absence of the particular jewelry that women in this room wore the way other women wore skin, the slight hesitation in how she stood, the fraction of a second it took her body to remember how to hold itself in a space it had never been invited to occupy. These things were invisible to no one. A woman near the entrance, silk hanbok modernized into something that cost more than Yeon-ji's monthly salary, pressed her lips together and looked sideways at the man beside her. He dipped his head. The sound that almost escaped her was swallowed just in time, but the shape of it was visible in the tremor of her jaw. Nobody laughed. They didn't need to. In rooms like this, contempt is a language spoken entirely in silence. Yeon-ji felt the assessment travel across her like hands she had never agreed to. She stood in the doorway of the Grand Joseon, the most photographed, most written about, most architecturally celebrated hotel in the country, the one whose lobby had been featured in 3 separate presidential state dinners. And she understood with her whole body that she was the wrong answer to a question no one had asked out loud. She was looking for a service entrance. She had been told this was a hospitality placement. One evening, private event, 800,000 won. She had been told to dress appropriately. She had not been told what she was actually walking into. She was 7 years old, the first time she understood that where she came from had a smell. It was the day of her primary school's spring presentation. The families of the Gangseo district children had been invited to watch their students perform a short play about the founding of Joseon. Yeon-ji had been cast as a market vendor, a small part, 6 lines, but she had memorized every syllable until they lived in her throat like music. Her mother, Seo Yeon-ji, had washed and pressed Yeon-ji's uniform twice, had braided her hair with the careful attention of a woman who understood that how her daughter looked at school was one of the only things she could control in a life that controlled very little else. Yeon worked the early shift at the fish processing facility in Yangchun, and her hands were always slightly raw, and she smelled faintly of the sea no matter how long she washed. And she loved Yeon-ji with the specific ferocity of a woman who has almost nothing and has decided that her daughter will have everything. Yeon-ji's costume for the play was a simple patterned wrap. She had made it herself from fabric scraps her mother had found, and she was proud of it in the wordless way children are proud of things they've built with their own hands. She was standing in the school hallway before the performance when the girl happened. Choi Da-yoon, the daughter of an import business owner from the nicer side of the district, whose uniform was always newer, whose lunch always smelled different, who had a way of looking at other children that was not unkind exactly, but was precise. Da-yoon had stopped in front of Yeon-ji and tilted her head. "Your costume smells like the market," she said, not loudly, not cruelly in the theatrical way of children who know they are being cruel, just as an observation delivered in the flat tone of someone stating a fact about the weather. The other girls nearby had gone quiet. One of them had looked at the floor. That was worse, somehow, than laughter. Yeon-ji had finished the performance. She had delivered all 6 lines without a single mistake. She had bowed when the audience clapped. She had walked home afterward through the narrow alleys of their neighborhood, past the pajangmatcha and the stacked shipping containers someone had converted into storage, past the drain that always smelled in summer, past the old haraboji who sat outside his door every evening and always nodded at her, and she had not told her mother what happened. She had said the performance went well. She had learned at 7 years old that there are things you carry alone because putting them down in front of the people who love you only means they have to carry them too. 21 years later, Seo Yeon-ji stood in the doorway of the Grand Josian ballroom and felt the same thing she had felt in that school hallway. The certainty of being correctly identified as something that did not belong. She had not known 3 days earlier, when the message came through the hospitality job board she checked every morning from the tiny screen of her phone, that the placement was anything other than what it said. One evening, formal event, hospitality support, experience in service settings preferred. She had experience, 7 years of it. Hotels, restaurants, catering events, one brief and miserable season at a ski resort in Gangnam where the guests treated the staff like furniture that occasionally had opinions. She was reliable. She was precise. She had never once been late. She had applied. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the application had been received by someone who found it funny. What she did not know was that her name had been read aloud in an office and met with laughter. What she did not know was that she had been selected not in spite of where she came from, but because of it. The Grand Josian, the most important private dinner of the quarter. The table where Jang Hyun-woo, the man who had built the Jang Hotel Group from a single business hotel in Incheon into a 12-property empire that included 3 5-star properties and a private members club in Itaewon that had a 3-year waiting list. The table where that man sat at the head, flanked by his senior directors and their partners, surrounded by the architecture of his own power. And into that room, as a joke, they had sent her. Seo Yeon-ji, 28 years old, Heuksok-dong, goshiwon 3rd floor, room 7, daughter of Ok-ya who still smelled faintly of the sea. She had no idea what had been arranged. She had no idea who was laughing and why. She had no idea that the man at the head of that table, the man with the stillness of someone who has made very large decisions in very quiet rooms, had already looked up from his conversation and was watching the doorway with the particular attention of a person who notices everything. She only knew the feeling she had learned at 7 years old in a school hallway. The feeling of walking into a room that had already decided what she was. She was wrong about one thing. This room had not decided anything yet. 3 days before the Grand Josian dinner, a woman named Park Jae-soo was sitting in the back office of Hana Staffing Solutions on the 14th floor of a building in Gangnam-gu, eating a tangerine in neat segments and reading job applications on a dual monitor setup that cost more than Yeon-ji made in 4 months. Jae-soo had been the senior placement coordinator at Hana Staffing for 6 years. She was 34, well-dressed in the specific way of women who spend a calculated percentage of their income on appearing to earn more of it, and she had a talent for identifying which applicants were worth her attention and which ones she could dispose of quickly. She had built her reputation on placing the right people in the right rooms. Beautiful people, polished people. People whose presence at a high-end event created the atmosphere the client was paying for. The Jang Hotel Group account, was her most important account. Director Kwon Sang-chul, the head of corporate events for the group, had called her personally that Tuesday afternoon. He had a tone she recognized, the lazy, slightly amused tone of a man who has held power long enough that he has forgotten what it costs other people. "I need someone for the Thursday dinner," he said. "Jang Hyun-woo's quarterly table, 20 guests, private ballroom, the usual arrangement." "I have 3 excellent candidates available," Jisoo said. She was already scrolling. "Cha Min-jeong has done 2 Jang events before," the feedback was. "Actually," Kwon said, and she heard it then, that particular brightness in his voice, the edge of something cutting. "I want you to send me the worst one." Jisoo had paused. "I'm sorry. The most unsuitable application in your current pool. Not incompetent, I don't want anyone dropping trays, just—" He let the word rest in the air for a moment. "Wrong, wrong for the room." Jisoo had been quiet long enough that Kwon laughed softly. "Chairman Jang has been making comments lately," he said, "about the staff being too uniform, too polished, says it feels like a performance." Another pause, and now his voice had acquired the particular satisfaction of a man executing a plan he finds clever. "I thought we'd give him something real, see how he handles it. The other directors think it'll be entertaining." Jisoo looked at her screen. She had 23 active applications in the hospitality pool. Her eyes moved to one near the bottom. Seo Yeon-ji, Heuksok-dong address. 7 years of service experience, hotels, catering, restaurants. Application written in plain, direct language with no formatting flourishes, no flattering photograph attached, no mention of university education because there was none to mention. Reliable, precise, never late. "I have someone," Jisoo said. She had told herself, as she typed the confirmation message, that the girl would be paid regardless. 800,000 won. She had told herself this was practically a favor, an evening in the Grand Joseon, a meal she would never otherwise eat, money she clearly needed. She had told herself these things in the efficient, practiced way of someone who has learned to make the inside of a decision look like a different decision than it actually is. She pressed send. In the open office beyond her door, her 2 junior coordinators, Harim and Dongjun, were already laughing at something on Harim's screen. Jisoo leaned to the door and told them about Kwon's request. The laughter that followed was not loud. It was the hushed, bright laughter of people who believe themselves to be far enough from the consequences of a thing that they can afford to find it funny. Harim covered her mouth. Dongjun shook his head with the satisfied expression of someone witnessing a punchline delivered well. "She's going to walk in and just," Harim started. "I know," Jisoo said. "And Kwon is going too." "I know." What none of them said, because it did not occur to any of them to say it was, "And then what happens to her?" Yeon-ji received the confirmation message at 6:47 in the evening, standing at the pajangmatcha downstairs waiting for her order of tteokbokki, which she ate 4 nights a week because it was filling and cost 3,000 won, and the haraboji who ran the cart always gave her extra fish cake without charging. She read the message twice. Grand Joseon Hotel, Thursday evening, formal dress required, car service arranged, 800,000 won upon completion. She stood with the phone in one hand and the paper cup of tteokbokki in the other, and she did the arithmetic the way she always did arithmetic, quickly, without sentiment, in terms of what it solved. Her mother's prescription refill, 60,000. The goshiwon rent, 3 days overdue, 350,000. The money she had been setting aside for the evening course in hotel management at the community college in Dongjak, 90,000 per semester, and she was 1 payment behind. The sum of everything pressing against her was a specific number she kept in her head the way some people keep a song, constantly, underneath everything else. The background frequency of a life lived too close to the edge of what it costs to stay alive in this city. 800,000 won was not a solution, But it was 3 weeks of breathing room, and breathing room was the closest thing to freedom she had learned to want. She went upstairs to her room. It was 8 square meters. A single mattress on a raised platform, a desk built into the wall, a window the size of a textbook that looked out at the ventilation unit of the building next door. On the desk, her notebook, a lamp. A photograph of her mother taken at Chuseok 4 years ago. Okeya laughing at something off camera with her hand half raised, the rough skin of her palm visible even in the small print. Yeon-ji sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the navy dress hanging on the hook behind the door. She had bought it for a job interview at a hotel in Mapogu 2 years ago. She had gotten the job, worked there 14 months, left when the manager began scheduling her off the floor and into the back whenever guests he considered important arrived. She had never said anything. She had simply found a different placement and moved on, the way she had always moved on, without ceremony, without the luxury of visible anger, carrying the weight of it somewhere internal where it could not be used against her. She took the dress down and laid it on the mattress and looked at it. Then she took out her mother's iron. Okeya called at 8, the way she called every Thursday. "Did you eat?" was always the first thing. "Tidiakbaki," Yeon-ji said. "That's not eating." But her mother's voice was warm when she said it, the familiar warmth of a complaint that is actually affection wearing a practical disguise. Yeon-ji told her about the placement. Not everything. She didn't say Grand Joseon, because her mother would ask questions, and the questions would circle back to why a staffing agency had called Yeon-ji's number for an event at the most prestigious private venue in Seoul, and Yeon-ji had not yet assembled an answer to that question that did not make her feel cold somewhere behind her sternum. She said a private dinner, good pay, one evening. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "What are you wearing?" "The navy dress." Another pause. Yeon-ji could hear the television in the background. Her mother still had cable, one of the few things she refused to give up. She said it was company, and the faint sound of the neighborhood outside Okeya's window in Gangseo, which was a different quality of city noise than Heuksok-dong but the same species of it. "Press it twice," Okeya said, "the collar especially." "I know, Iyama." "And stand up straight." Her mother's voice shifted, became something more direct, the register she used when she was saying something she had already said many times and intended to keep saying until it took root. "You walk into rooms like you are already apologizing for being there. I've watched you do it since you were small. You tuck yourself in. You make yourself a smaller shape." "Iyama." "I'm not finished." A breath. "You have worked harder than anyone in any room you have ever walked into. You know more. You have paid more to be standing wherever you are standing. You do not owe that room an apology. You do not owe anyone in it a smaller version of yourself." Her voice settled. "Walk in like you already know where you're going, even if you don't, especially if you don't." Yeon-ji pressed the phone against her ear and looked at the photograph on the desk. Okeya mid-laugh, hand raised, the rough palm, the sea she could never quite wash off. "I'll call you when I'm home," Yeon-ji said. "You call me when you're ready, not before." After she hung up, Yeon-ji pressed the dress twice, the collar especially. She polished her shoes with a cloth and a small tin of black wax she kept in the desk drawer. She pinned her hair the way she had seen it done in a magazine left behind in the hotel lobby where she had worked in Mapo, a smooth, low arrangement that required no products she didn't own. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the desk. The mirror was not large enough to show her whole body. This had always struck her as either a mercy or an insult, depending on the day. Tonight she looked at only her face. Brown eyes, sharp jaw, the particular quality of stillness that comes not from confidence but from years of practicing stillness as a survival strategy in rooms where being visible in the wrong way was a cost she couldn't afford. She thought about Dayun in the school hallway. "Your costume smells like the market." She thought about the hotel manager in Mapo, moving her to the back. She thought about every room that had looked at her and rearranged its furniture to keep her at the edge of it. Then she picked up her bag, turned off the lamp, and went downstairs to wait for the car. The car was black. The driver did not speak. The city moved past the windows in the particular way it moves at night, all light and distance, the Han River appearing briefly between buildings like a dark mirror. And Yeon-ji sat with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight and her jaw set, and she did not look at her reflection in the window. She was not thinking about the room she was going to. She was thinking about her mother's voice. Walk in like you already know where you're going. The Grand Joseon came into view between two older buildings on Sogong Row, its glass facade catching the city's light and throwing it back doubled. A doorman in white gloves stood at the entrance. Potted orchids flanked the steps. A woman in an emerald dress was being helped from a vehicle 3 cars ahead, her laughter carried backward on the cold October air. Yeon-ji stepped out of the car. She stood on the pavement for exactly 3 seconds. Then she walked toward the entrance with her back straight and her chin level, and the navy dress moving correctly around her. And she carried with her 8 square meters of room above a pajangmacha, and a photograph of a woman mid-laugh, and 6 lines of dialogue delivered without a single mistake, and 21 years of walking into rooms that had already decided what she was. She did not know that the decision had already been made about her, and not the one she feared. She did not know that in the ballroom ahead, a man named Jang Hyun-woo had already looked up. She did not know anything yet. She only walked. The Grand Joseon Ballroom had been designed by an architect who believed that luxury was not about abundance, but about the precise calibration of what you allowed people to see. The ceiling was not ornate. It was high, 4 stories of restrained plasterwork in the color of old ivory, and the effect was not grandeur so much as a particular species of silence that wealth buys and keeps. The chandeliers were Austrian crystal, but hung low and warm, so the light they produced was intimate rather than theatrical. The table stretched 20 seats long and was set with a formality that suggested the people who used it regularly found formality as natural as breathing. 19 of the 20 seats were occupied when Yeon-ji walked in. She had found the ballroom through a side corridor after a member of the hotel staff, a young man who would not meet her eyes, had directed her from the lobby with the clipped efficiency of someone completing a task they had been told to complete without elaboration. He had said, "Second left, end of the hall." The double doors. He had not said anything else. She had walked the corridor alone, her footsteps quiet on the runner carpet, past framed black and white photographs of the hotel in earlier decades, past a flower arrangement that was taller than she was, and she had arrived at the double doors and pushed them open and stepped inside. The silence that followed was instantaneous. Not the natural pause of a group of people momentarily distracted. Something more organized than that. The specific, loaded quiet that descends when a room has been waiting, consciously or otherwise, for something to go wrong, and the wrong thing has finally arrived on schedule. 20 faces turned toward her. 19 of them arranged themselves. In the fraction of a second it takes a practiced social reflex to engage into expressions of polite blankness. The 20th did not bother. Director Kwon Sang-chul was sitting 4 seats from the head of the table on the left side, between a woman in a wine-red dress and a man whose jacket had the particular sheen of cashmere that has been dry-cleaned more times than it can be counted. He was 51 years old, with the soft certainty of a man whose position had never seriously been challenged. And when Seo Yeon-ji walked through the double doors of the Grand Joseon Ballroom in her navy dress from Noryeongjin Market, the expression on his face was not cruelty. It was worse than cruelty. It was amusement in its most settled form, the amusement of a man watching the punchline of a joke. He wrote himself land exactly where he aimed it. His lips pressed together. His eyes moved from Yeon-ji to the man at the head of the table and back again, quick and satisfied, the eyes of someone taking inventory of a scene they intend to describe later. Beside him, the woman in the wine-red dress, his deputy, Lee So-young, who had been in the planning conversation from the beginning and had laughed the second longest, looked at Yeon-ji and then looked at her water glass. The corner of her mouth moved. She covered it with a sip. 2 seats further down, the third member of what would later be described simply as the arrangement, Yong Byung-ho, head of guest relations, who had suggested the specific framing of the invitation, tilted his head the way a person tilts their head when watching something they expected and are pleased to find themselves correct about. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The room's assessment of Yeon-ji happened in the way that these assessments always happen, completely, simultaneously, and without a single word spoken. It traveled from the entrance of the ballroom to every seat at the table in under 4 seconds, a full inventory taken and concluded. The dress, the shoes, the hair, the absence of the particular accessories that women in this room wore as casually as names. The way she stood in the doorway for the half-second too long of someone who has walked into a space and understood immediately that the space was not expecting her. Or rather, that it was expecting her for reasons she was only beginning to understand. Yeon-ji's throat tightened. She looked for what she had been told to look for: a service station, a coordinator, someone with a clipboard and an earpiece who would direct her to her position for the evening. There was none. There was only the long table and the 19 faces and the chandeliers and the silence that had not yet broken. She stood in the doorway of the grand Joseon ballroom in her pressed navy dress, and she felt, traveling across her skin like a change in air pressure, the precise shape of what had been done to her. Not confusion, not surprise, the recognition that is worse than both of those things, the recognition that arrives in the body before it arrives in the mind, the knowledge that the room you have walked into was built, in this specific instance, to watch you fail. She did not turn around. She had learned at 7 years old not to turn around. Jang Hyun-woo had been sitting at the head of his table for 11 minutes and had not been entirely present for any of them. He was 56, lean in the way of men who do not think about being lean because their attention is consumed by other things, with close-cropped hair that had gone fully silver at 42, and which he had never considered altering because the idea of altering his appearance for the benefit of anyone else's comfort was, to him, as foreign as a language he had never had cause to learn. His face was angular and composed in the particular way of someone who has spent decades in rooms where reacting visibly to anything is a form of weakness he cannot afford. His eyes were dark and moved with the unhurried precision of a man accustomed to seeing everything and choosing very deliberately what to respond to. He had been listening to a conversation about the projected renovation timeline for the Busan property with the surface of his attention, while the rest of him sat slightly apart from the evening, the way it sometimes did at his own gatherings, observing the room from the inside with the detached quality of someone who has hosted enough of these events to find them, in certain moments, less interesting than the thoughts they allow him to have. He had heard the doors open. He had looked up. And in the 3 seconds that followed, while 19 other people in the room completed their assessment of Seo Yeon-ji and filed it under a category that required no further thought, Jang Hyun-woo had completed a different kind of assessment entirely. He saw the dress pressed twice, the collar especially, he could tell by the line of it. He saw the shoes clean, slightly wrong for the room, maintained with the care of someone who owns few things and keeps them well. He saw the way she stood in the doorway and did not retreat, and he understood that not retreating had cost her something, because he could see in the set of her jaw and the particular quality of her stillness that it was not ease but will that was holding her in place. He saw Kwon, the expression, the quick inventory-taking glance in his direction. He had seen that expression before. He knew exactly what it meant. Something shifted in the room's temperature that only one person at the table noticed, because it was too small to register, except to someone who had learned to read Jang Hyun-woo at close range over many years. His assistant, seated discreetly against the wall behind him, saw his right hand, which had been resting open on the table, close slowly into a loose, deliberate fist. Then he stood up. The room noticed the moment he rose the way water notices a stone dropped into it, a ripple outward from the center, immediate and total. Conversations didn't pause. They ended. Every face at the table recalibrated in the direction of the head chair with the trained, reflexive attention of people for whom Jang Hyun-woo's movements have long functioned as a signal that supersedes all other signals in any room he occupies. He walked the length of the table. He did not walk quickly. He did not walk with the energy of a man responding to a situation. He walked with the same unhurried, absorptive attention he brought to everything, as though the walk itself was considered, as though he had made a decision some time ago and was now simply executing it without urgency because urgency would suggest that the outcome was uncertain, and for him it was not. Every person at the table watched him. Kwon Sang-chul's expression, in the 2 seconds it took Jang to cross the first half of the room, cycled through several revisions, the satisfied amusement receding by degrees into something less settled, something that was trying to remain confident and finding the effort unfamiliar. Jang Hyun-woo stopped in front of Seo Yeon-ji. She had not moved. Her chin was level. Her hands were still. If she was afraid, and some part of her was, the part that had learned at 7 years old what it costs to stand in a doorway that does not want you, she had put it somewhere he could not see, the same internal place she had been storing things since childhood, the place that had become, over 21 years, very large and very organized. He looked at her, not the traveling assessment the room had performed, something different, the look of someone reading rather than measuring. "You are the placement from Hana Staffing," he said. His voice was quiet and carried without effort, the way voices carry in rooms with good acoustics and no competing noise, because the room had produced none. Yes, her voice was steady. She had not known it would be until it was. There has been a misrepresentation about the nature of this placement. It was not a question. She looked at him. I was told it was a hospitality support role. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise, the expression of a man who has confirmed a calculation he had already made. "You were told incorrectly," he said. "This is a private dinner. You are a guest." The silence that had been hovering over the table since he stood settled now into a different quality entirely. The silence not of anticipation, but of recalibration, the silence of 19 people updating, simultaneously and without recourse, the story they had told themselves about what this evening was going to be. Kwon Sang-chul had gone very still. Jang Hyun-woo extended his hand, palm upward, fingers relaxed, the gesture of a man who opens doors rather than guards them. Yeon-ji looked at the hand. Clean nails, a scar along the base of the thumb, old, faded, the kind that comes from physical work done early in a life that later becomes unrecognizable to the hands that lived it. No rings. She looked up at his face. She had been looked at all evening. She knew every variety of it, the measuring look, the dismissing look, the amused look that Kwon had worn like a badge. This was none of those. This was the look of someone who has found a thing in an unexpected place and is not surprised by it so much as confirmed, as though he had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for exactly this. She placed her hand in his. He led her to the empty seat beside his own, at the head of the table. He pulled the chair out. She sat. The chair was upholstered in a charcoal velvet that was cool against the backs of her arms, and a water glass appeared to her left, and a menu card was set before her, and the room, after the briefest seismic pause, resumed its surface. Conversations restarted. Wine was poured. A server moved silently along the far wall. But the room had been rearranged. Not the furniture, the air inside it. The invisible architecture of who mattered and why had been quietly, irrevocably, publicly rebuilt in the 60 seconds. It had taken Jang Hyun-woo to walk the length of his own table and extend his hand to a woman in a navy dress from a clearance rack in Noryeongjin Market. Because Jang Hyun-woo's choices were not questioned in rooms he owned. They were only observed and obeyed. Kwon Sang-chul picked up his wine glass and put it down again without drinking. Lee So-young was studying the tablecloth. Young Byung-ho had the expression of a man running a rapid internal audit of everything he had said and done in the past 72 hours. Yeon-ji felt the room's confusion like a shift in barometric pressure, surrounding her, unable to resolve itself into anything she was required to respond to. She straightened her back. She picked up her water glass. She did not smile. She did not perform relief or gratitude or any of the emotions a woman in her position was perhaps expected to perform for the benefit of the room. She sat at the head of the table of the most powerful man in the Korean hotel industry in her pressed navy dress, and she was simply present fully, quietly, without apology. Outside, Seoul carried on. The Han River moved between its banks in the dark. Somewhere in Gangseo, in a small apartment above a street going quiet for the evening, Ok-ya was watching television and not yet waiting for the phone to ring. And at the head of the grand Joseon table, a man who had built an empire on the principle that real things are rarer than expensive things leaned almost imperceptibly toward the woman beside him and said, quietly, so only she could hear, "I apologize for the misrepresentation. I intend to understand how it happened." She looked at him. "So do I," she said. The first course arrived in the particular silence of a kitchen that has been told to perform flawlessly and understands the weight of that instruction. Heuksok-dong, plated with the architectural restraint of a chef who has learned that the most expensive thing a dish can communicate is its own confidence. No garnish for its own sake. No sauce applied to impress rather than compliment. The seafood was arranged in a shallow bowl of burnished clay, the broth beneath it dark and fragrant with dried chili, and the particular depth that comes only from a stock built over many hours rather than accelerated. Yeon-ji looked at it. Then she looked at the room. 19 people were eating with the practiced ease of people for whom this quality of food is the baseline, not a pleasure to be remarked upon, simply the expected floor of an evening. Chopsticks moved. Conversation resumed. The table's attention, redistributed after the realignment of the past 10 minutes, settled back into the comfortable patterns of people who have spent many evenings together and know the social topography well enough to navigate it without looking. She picked up her chopsticks. She ate the way she always ate in public, slowly, in portions smaller than her hunger, with the particular consciousness of a woman who has learned that eating is never only eating when other people are watching, that it is always also a performance being evaluated by an audience she has not consented to acquire. She had learned this early. She had learned to make herself small at the table, which was its own specific cruelty, because the table was one of the few places where she had always felt most genuinely, most entirely herself. She loved food with the totality of someone for whom it had never been decorative. Growing up in Gangseo, food was the language Ok-ya spoke most fluently. Not abundance, but precision. The particular intelligence of a woman who could feed 2 people on ingredients that should have fed 1. Who could make doenjang jjigae from a refrigerator that looked empty. Who understood that care was a thing you could put into a pot, and that a person eating it would feel it even if they couldn't name it. Yeon-ji had grown up in that kitchen, and she had absorbed it the way children absorb the things that save them. "You are eating carefully," Jang Hyun-woo said. He was looking at his own bowl, his chopsticks resting across the rim. He said it the way he seemed to say most things, without the rising inflection of a question, without the softening of small talk. A plain observation, offered to the air between them. "I always eat carefully," she said. That is not the same as enjoying it. She set her chopsticks down. The broth is oversalted. He looked at her then. At the base, she said, and she heard herself as if from a slight distance, the words coming out with the same unguarded momentum that had always gotten her into trouble in professional settings, the expertise tumbling out before the part of her that had learned caution could intercept it. Whoever made the stock didn't account for the reduction. The ganjang was added before the simmer rather than after, so the salt intensified instead of integrating. The seafood itself is excellent, the ganjang jejang especially. That's been marinated correctly, at least 3 days, but the base is working against it. The table had not gone quiet, but the man beside her had. Jang Hyun-woo was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately classify, which was unusual because she had spent her professional life learning to classify the expressions of the people she served, to read in real time what a face needed from her, what it was about to require, whether it was the face of someone whose evening was going well or poorly, and what that meant for her next move. This face was doing something she didn't have a category for. "You cook," he said. "I've worked in kitchens, primarily front of house, but in smaller operations you learn everything. Then you understand what this dish was attempting." Yes, it was attempting to be simple. She paused. It almost succeeded. Simple is harder than complicated. Complicated gives you places to hide. Simple is either correct or it isn't. He was quiet for a moment. Around them the dinner continued, a burst of laughter from the far end of the table, the soft percussion of cutlery, the low orchestral movement of a gathering finding its rhythm. Inside that surrounding noise, the space between Yeon-ji and Jang Hyun-woo had become something separate, a smaller room inside the large one. "Where did you learn to understand food this way?" he asked. "My mother's kitchen in Gangseo." She said it without hesitation, without the slight modulation she sometimes applied to the mention of where she came from in professional settings, the unconscious softening, the minor geography of shame. It came out plain and she let it stay that way. We didn't have much, but she never made anything carelessly. She said that the attention you put into food is what makes it food instead of just ingredients. You can taste the difference. Jang picked up his chopsticks, tried the broth, set them down again. "She is correct," he said, "and the kitchen tonight will hear about the ganjang. It doesn't need to be a complaint, it's a small error. In my hotels, small errors in a kitchen at this level are not small." His voice had not changed temperature, but something in it had become more precise, the voice of a man shifting registers from dinner conversation to the other mode he operated in. "They are the beginning of larger ones. I am not angry. I am interested in where the gap is." "That's a reasonable way to run things," Yeon-ji said. "You sound surprised." "I've worked in a lot of hotels. Reasonable is rarer than expensive." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile, something that preceded it, like the first detectable light before sunrise, the moment the darkness changes quality without yet becoming anything else. The second course came, and the conversation built itself the way good conversation builds. Not designed, not performed, but accumulated. One thing leading to the next through the natural gravity of two people who have found, unexpectedly, that the other one is worth the full weight of their attention. He asked about the hotels she had worked in. She told him, not the resume version, not the practiced professional summary, but the actual version, the texture of it. The ski resort in Gangwon where the guests spoke to the staff in the second person plural, as though addressing a category rather than a person. The boutique hotel in Mapo whose general manager had understood hospitality as a performance put on for guests rather than a genuine orientation toward their comfort, which meant the staff performed beautifully and delivered badly, and no one in management could understand the gap between the reviews and the repeat booking numbers. The catering company in Uido, where she had worked a government reception, and watched 3 different senior officials deliver identical speeches about innovation, while the staff stood against the walls in silence for 4 hours without being offered water. Jang listened, not the half-listening of a powerful man tolerating a perspective he has not requested. She would have recognized that immediately. The full listening, the kind that asks questions that arrive slightly sideways, that catch the thing underneath the thing she actually said. The Mapo Hotel, he said. The gap between reviews and repeat bookings. What was the actual mechanism? She thought about it. Guests reviewed the surface. The decor, the food, the check-in experience, all of it was executed well because the manager understood theater. But hospitality isn't theater. Theater ends when the performance ends. Hospitality is what happens when you're not performing. She paused. People can feel the difference. They can't always name it, but it shows up in whether they come back. He looked at her. That is the most precise description of what distinguishes a transactional hotel from a destination that I have heard in 11 years of running this company. She looked back at him. That seems unlikely. I don't say things that are unlikely. You're surrounded by people who are paid to tell you what you want to hear. That affects the baseline. The silence that followed was half a second long and contained. Within it, something she could feel but not yet name. A shift in how he was looking at her. A minor seismic adjustment, as though the ground had moved fractionally and everything standing on it had to find its new footing. Yes, he said, it does. The dessert course had come and gone, and the table had begun its slow dissolution. Guests excusing themselves in pairs, the choreography of a formal evening winding down, the particular calibrated warmth of farewells exchanged between people who will see each other again at the next quarterly dinner, and will say at that point how quickly time has passed. Each departure involved a stop at the head of the table, a handshake, a murmured exchange, the specific quality of deference that sits between respect and something more instinctual. A man whose firm handled the legal architecture of Jang's 3 Gangnam properties. A woman who ran communications for the group's newest acquisition in Jeju. A chairman from a construction conglomerate who called Jang by a shortened form of his name that no one else in the room used. Several of them looked at Yeon-ji as they passed. Some with the recalibrated neutrality of people who have updated their assessment and chosen not to display the update. Some with something less neutral, curiosity edged with a discomfort they could not entirely suppress, the discomfort of people whose category system has been interrupted and not yet repaired. Kwon Sang-chul was among the last to approach. He had spent the second half of the dinner in a version of himself that was quieter than the version that had arrived. The wine-red dress woman beside him, Lee So-young, had said very little since the seating rearrangement. Yong Byung-ho had excused himself from the table briefly around the third course, and returned with a face that had been wiped into professional blankness, with the thoroughness of a man who has spent the intervening minutes in a hallway reassessing a decision. Kwon extended his hand to Jang with the fluency of a man who has made this gesture many times and knows how to make it look like more than it is. Excellent evening, he said. The Jeju timeline. I'll have my office call yours on Friday, Jang said. Kwon nodded. He turned toward Yeon-ji with the brief, angled acknowledgement of someone completing a social obligation they wish did not exist. A pleasure, he said. Yeon-ji looked at him. Yes, she said. She did not make it easier than that. When the room was empty, when the last set of footsteps had faded down the corridor, and the servers had begun the quiet work of clearing the table, and the candles had burned down to their final hour, Jang Hyun-woo did not move from his chair. He sat at the head of his empty table with a glass of barley tea, and looked at the woman beside him with the specific quality of attention he brought to things he had decided required it. You know what this evening actually was, he said. She had known since the moment she walked in. She had known with her whole body even before her mind had assembled the full picture. She had known the way you know a familiar pain, not by thinking about it, but by the way it settles into the places in your body where it has lived before. Yes, she said. Someone at the staffing agency arranged for you to be placed in this room as a source of entertainment, for the benefit of people at this table. He said it plainly, the way he said everything, without ornament, without the softening that would have made the words easier to deliver and less true. Director Kwon made the request. He was supported by 2 members of his team. They selected you specifically. The confirmation arrived in her body before it finished arriving in her mind. She had suspected. She had known. But suspicion and knowledge are different weights, and knowledge is the heavier one. It settles differently, it takes up more space, it asks more of you. She was quiet for a moment. They thought you would dismiss me, she said. Or worse, that you'd let the room do it. Yes. And instead, I seated you at my table. He set down his tea. Because the alternative was to participate in something I find, he paused, and in the pause she heard him searching for the word that was accurate rather than the word that was generous. Contemptible, he said. She looked at him. I grew up in Incheon, he said, above a hardware store that my father owned, and that did not make enough money in any year I can remember to make the end of the month feel safe. I attended a school where the teachers' expectations of children adjusted automatically based on what neighborhood they came from, an adjustment so internalized they didn't know they were making it. He turned his tea glass slowly on the tablecloth. I know what a room looks like when it has already decided what you are before you open your mouth. I know it because I spent the first 20 years of my life in rooms exactly like that. Yeon-ji felt something shift inside her. Not surprise, she had understood from the quality of his listening that he was a man who had come from something, that the ease he wore in this room was earned rather than inherited. But hearing it stated plainly, in the empty ballroom of the hotel whose name he now carried, was different. The people at this table, he continued, have spent the last 3 hours believing that the arrangement was designed to entertain them. Some of them were correct. 3 of them were actively complicit in designing it. His voice had changed. Not louder, quieter, in the particular way of a man for whom quiet is not the absence of force but its most concentrated form. I know who they are. I have known since approximately 40 seconds after you walked through those doors. What will you do? Yeon-ji asked. He looked at her. The candlelight moved across the angles of his face, and she could see in it, very briefly, the boy from Incheon, the boy who had walked to school through a city that had already written him a story he did not intend to live. What I always do, he said, when I discover that someone I have placed in a position of trust has used that position to do something I find contemptible. He picked up his phone from the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down without unlocking it. Not tonight, he said. Tonight I am still a host. He looked at her. Something in his expression had opened slightly, the controlled surface admitting, in a narrow margin, something that was neither professional nor strategic but simply human. Tell me about your mother's kitchen, he said. What she made when the ingredients were almost nothing. And in the empty ballroom of the Grand Joseon, with the candles burning low and the city pressing its lights against the tall windows, Seo Yeon-ji from Heuksok-dong, from Gangseo, from the goshiwon above the pajangmacha, from the school hallway where a girl in a modernized hanbok had delivered the precise coordinates of her place in the world, she talked. She talked about doenjang jjigi made from almost nothing, about her mother's hands, about the intelligence of a woman who had never had the luxury of being careless with anything, least of all love, and who had therefore made both food and love with the same meticulous, unglamorous attention to what each moment actually needed. Jang Hyun-woo listened with the full weight of himself. And outside, in the corridor, the young staff member who had directed Yeon-ji to the ballroom with averted eyes stood near the service entrance and heard, distantly, the sound of a conversation continuing well past the hour when the dinner was scheduled to end. He did not understand what he was hearing. He only knew that in 11 years of working events at the Grand Joseon, he had never once heard Chairman Jang stay at the table alone after the guests had gone. The car that took Yeon-ji home was the same black vehicle that had brought her, but it felt like a different journey entirely. She sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap and her shoes still on and her back still straight from the hours of holding herself correctly in a room that had required it, and she watched Seoul move past the windows. The Han River, the bridges, the particular darkness of the water at night reflecting the city back at itself in fragments. And somewhere on the Dongjak Bridge, she stopped holding herself correctly and let her spine find the seat back and breathed. The car was silent. The driver did not speak. The heater ran at a low, steady frequency. She did not cry. She had thought in the ballroom that she might cry later, that the architecture of the evening would eventually collapse into something she would need to release. But what she felt, sitting in the back of the car at 11:47 on a Thursday night crossing the Han River in her navy dress, was not the pressure of something held too long. It was something quieter and stranger than that. It was the particular disorientation of a person whose category system has been interrupted. She had categories. She had built them carefully over 28 years from the reliable material of experience. What rooms wanted from her, what they would give her, what they would take, where the edges were, and how to stay on the correct side of them without losing more of herself than was absolutely required. The categories were not pessimism. They were precision. They were the difference between being surprised by the world's cruelty and being prepared for it. And she had always believed that preparation was the more useful orientation. The Grand Joseon had not fit any of her categories. Jang Hyun-woo had not fit any of her categories. She looked at the river until it disappeared behind the next set of buildings, and then she looked at her own reflection in the window, the navy dress, the careful hair beginning to loosen at the edges, the face of a woman trying to understand what has just happened to her. And she thought about what he had said at the end of the evening, when she had stood to leave, and he had walked with her to the corridor. "I would like to continue this conversation," said plainly, without the performance of casualness, without the elaborate architecture of implication that men in his position typically used to communicate desire while maintaining deniability. Simply, "I would like to continue this conversation," as though the thing between them was already established enough to be named without risk. She had said, "I'm not sure what that means." He had said, "It means I would like to have dinner with you again, somewhere you choose." She had looked at him in the corridor outside the Grand Joseon ballroom, this man with the silver hair and the scar on his thumb, and the voice that carried without effort and the childhood above a hardware store in Incheon that he had mentioned once, and then returned to his composed surface. And she had understood that the correct response was not the one her category system was producing. She had said, "I'll think about it." He had nodded, once, the nod of a man who is not accustomed to "I'll think about it" and finds it, unexpectedly, more interesting than the alternative. The car stopped in front of the building in Heuksok-dong. The Pajangmacha below was closed, the Haraboji gone home hours ago, the street quiet in the particular way of streets that are never fully quiet but reach at night a lower frequency of noise that passes for peace. She went upstairs. She took off the navy dress and hung it carefully. She sat on the edge of the mattress in the 8-square-meter room and looked at the photograph of her mother on the desk. "Okay," ya mid-laugh, hand raised, the sea she couldn't wash off. Yeon-ji picked up her phone, put it down, picked it up again. She called her mother at 12:15. "I said call when you're ready," "Okay," ya said, without hello, without surprise. She had clearly not been asleep. "I'm ready." "How was it?" Yeon-ji looked at the window, the ventilation unit of the building next door, the narrow rectangle of sky above it, one visible star or possibly a satellite. "Strange," she said. "It was strange, Iyama." Strange good or strange bad? She thought about the ballroom, The silence when she walked in, Kwon's face, the way Jang had stood up and walked the length of the room with the unhurried certainty of a man for whom the outcome was never in question. The empty table afterward, the candles, the conversation about her mother's kitchen, the doenjang jjigi, his full attention like a physical thing you could feel the weight of. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'll tell you when I know." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you stand up straight?" "Yes." "Good, okay," Ya said. "Come home Sunday, I'll make sialiangtang, the real kind, not the shortcut." "I know you don't make the shortcut." "I'm telling you anyway." A pause. "Sleep Yeon-jaya." She slept. He called at 8:15 the next morning. She was at the community sink at the end of the goshiwon corridor, washing a coffee cup, when her phone buzzed on the shelf beside her. An unknown number. Seoul area code. She looked at it for 2 full rings before answering. "I said I would think about it," she said, without hello. A brief silence, then you thought quickly. "I haven't decided yet." "Then I've called at the right time." His voice on the phone was the same as in person, quiet, carrying, unperformed. "I know a place in Yuljiro. They make sunjubu jjigi that I have been unable to improve upon despite 11 years and significant resources. I would like your assessment." "You want me to evaluate your competitors, sunjubu jjigi?" "I want to have breakfast with you. The evaluation would be a secondary benefit." She leaned against the corridor wall with her clean coffee cup and looked at the water stain on the ceiling that had been there since she moved in and that the landlord had photographed twice and done nothing about. "Yuljiro," she said, 9:30. 9:30, he said. The Sunjubu Jjigi place in Yuljiro was not the kind of establishment that appeared in the food guides that hotels like the Grand Joseon recommended to their guests. It was 3 steps below street level, access through a door with a handwritten sign and marker, with 8 tables covered in laminate printed with a pattern of autumn leaves, a television mounted near the ceiling perpetually tuned to a morning news program, and a Hineo grandmother who worked the kitchen alone and had been working it alone, according to the laminated card on each table, for 41 years. Jang Hyun-woo arrived before her, which she had not expected. He was sitting at a corner table in a coat she recognized as expensive in the specific way of things that do not announce their expense, reading something on his phone with the focused attention he appeared to apply to everything. He had not brought anyone with him. No assistant, no driver waiting visibly, no suggestion of the apparatus that she imagined normally surrounded a man of his position. He stood when she came in. She sat across from him at the laminate table under the autumn leaves and looked at him in the fluorescent light of a basement restaurant in Yuljiro, and he looked exactly the same as he had in the candlelight of the Grand Joseon ballroom, which told her something she filed carefully. The grandmother brought sunjubu jjigi without being asked. It arrived in the stone pot still at a full rolling boil, the surface moving, the color of it deep red-orange. The egg dropped in whole and still cooking in the residual heat. Yeon-ji looked at it, then she tasted it. The broth had been built over a very long time from anchovy and kelp, and something else she couldn't immediately identify, a depth note that arrived after the heat, underneath the gochugaru. The tofu was silken in the correct sense of the word, not the way mass-produced tofu was silken, but the way something is silken when it has been made by a person who understands what silken actually means. The clams had been added at the exact right moment, open just enough, not past it. "The anchovy stock has been going for at least 2 days, she said. "I believe it never stops," Jang said. "I've asked, she doesn't answer that question." Smart woman. Formidably. He was watching her eat, not the way the room had watched her the night before, not inventory or assessment. Attention. The way you watch someone when you are genuinely interested in what they are experiencing. "Well, you can't improve on this," she said, "and you shouldn't try. Whatever instinct told you to leave it alone was correct." He nodded. drank his broth directly from the bowl the way the grandmother had wordlessly indicated was the correct method, without the self-consciousness of a man for whom the gesture was beneath him. She watched him do it, and something loosened slightly in the center of her chest, some coiled, watchful thing that had been waiting for the performance to slip and reveal a different version of him underneath. It didn't slip. There was no different version. What she had seen in the Grand Joseon was what was here, in the fluorescent light of a basement in Yuljiro, eating silken tofu from a laminate table. He was the same person in both rooms. She thought, that is the rarest thing. They had breakfast for 2 hours. He asked about the community college course in hotel management. She had mentioned it the night before in passing, and he had registered it with the precision of a man who registers everything. She told him about the payment she was behind on. She said it plainly, without the modulation of shame, the same way she had said gangseo, the same way she had said goshiwon when he asked where she lived. He did not respond to any of it with the particular softness that she recognized as pity wearing the costume of warmth. He responded with the direct attention of someone who is cataloging information they consider relevant. "The course is at Dongjak Community College," he said. "Yes." "Who teaches the facilities management module?" "Professor Ongiti. He worked operations at the Shilla for 12 years before she stopped, looked at him. Why? Because Ongiti is one of the 3 best operations minds I have encountered in this industry, and the fact that he is teaching a community college course in Dongjak is either a significant loss for the industry or a significant gain for his students, and I have not yet determined which." He said it without a pause. "You should not be behind on the payment." "I'm aware." "I will not offer to pay it," he said, "because you would decline and it would make the rest of this breakfast uncomfortable." She looked at him. "You're correct." "I'm nodding it," he said, "because there are other ways to solve it that don't require you to decline anything. We will get to that." He picked up his bowl again. "Finish your jjigae." 3 weeks after the Grand Joseon dinner, on a Tuesday evening in late October when the ginkgo trees in the streets of Gangnam-gu had turned entirely gold, and the air had acquired the specific sharpness that Seoul air gets when the seasons commit, Jang Hyun-woo took Yeon-ji to meet his mother. He had mentioned her twice in passing, once over the Sunjubu jjigae, once during a walk along the Chingyecheon stream after a gallery opening. He had brought Yeon-ji to on the basis that he was required to attend and preferred not to suffer through it without someone whose observations he valued. Both times the mention had been brief and careful, which told Yeon-ji that the subject was not brief and careful to him at all. Jang Myung-hee lived in an apartment in Mapo-gu that she had occupied for 31 years. It was on the 4th floor of a building that predated the neighborhood's recent renovation, with a stairwell that smelled of cooking and the particular compressed warmth of a building that has been lived in continuously and without interruption for decades. The door had 3 locks and a mat outside it printed with a pattern of cranes. She opened the door before they knocked. She was 73 years old and small in the way of women who have never been small in any sense that mattered, with Jang's dark eyes set in a face that had done considerable living and showed every year of it without apology. She was wearing a house cardigan and indoor slippers, and she looked at Yeon-ji with the direct, unhurried assessment of a woman who has earned the right to look at people however she chooses. "So," she said, "not hello, not a greeting of any conventional form, just so." "Jang Myung-hee," her son said, in a tone Yeon-ji had not yet heard from him, something younger, something that had the slight compression of a man in the presence of the only person whose opinion has always and will always supersede his own. "This is Seo Yeon-ji." "I know who she is," his mother said. "You've mentioned her 4 times in 3 weeks. For you that's a declaration." She stepped back from the door. "Come in, I made japchae. The glass noodles are from the good shop, not the supermarket, before you say anything about it." The apartment was warm and full of the accumulated evidence of a life, photographs on every surface. a bookshelf that had exceeded its capacity, and resolved the problem by stacking books horizontally on top of vertical ones. A small altar in the corner, with a photograph of a man whose jaw was unmistakably his son's. A sewing machine that appeared to be in active use. The kitchen smelled of sesame oil and the particular sweetness of the japchae vegetables that had been sautéed individually before combining. The correct method, the patient method, the method of someone who understands that shortcuts in a kitchen are a form of disrespect to the person eating. Myung-hee seated Yeon-ji at the kitchen table with the authority of a woman who has been directing the movement of people through this apartment for 3 decades and expects compliance. "Your mother," she said, settling across from Yeon-ji while her son opened the refrigerator with the ease of a man who knows where everything is kept. "She's in Gangseo." "Yes, she can't travel easily. She'd like to, but the bus." "I know the bus situation in Gangseo," Myung-hee said. "I grew up in Yongchun. Before they built the line, it took me 40 minutes to get to work by 3 transfers." She looked at Yeon-ji with the precision of someone conducting an assessment they have been anticipating. "Your mother raised you alone." "Since I was 11. And you've been sending money home." It was not a question. Yeon-ji looked at her. "Yes." "Good." Myung-hee reached across the table and put her hand over Yeon-ji's. It was a hand that had cleaned other people's houses and raised a son alone after a hardware store closed, and a father's health failed, and a family had to decide what it was made of, a hand that had answered that question every day for 30 years without wavering. The grip was extraordinary. "My son," Myung-hee said without looking at him, "has had many people sit at this table, impressive people, people who spoke to me with the careful warmth of those who understand that the mother must be managed." She paused. "Not one of them ate my food like they meant it." She looked at Yeon-ji's plate. Yeon-ji had eaten half the japchae with the attentive, honest pleasure of someone for whom the quality of the cooking had overridden the self-consciousness of being watched. "The glass noodles are from the good shop," Yeon-ji said. "You can taste the difference in the texture, and you've added something to the soy. Is that pear juice?" Myung-hee looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her expression, the particular movement of a door opening in a face that has kept itself mostly closed for a very long time. "Asian pear," she said. "My mother's method. Most people don't notice. It cuts the salt and adds a sweetness that doesn't announce itself. You taste it without knowing you're tasting it." Yeon-ji paused. "It's the right choice. The japchae doesn't need to be louder. It's already saying enough." In the kitchen doorway, Jang Hyun-woo had gone completely still. His mother looked at him over Yeon-ji's shoulder. Whatever passed between them in that look was private and complete. 30 years of shorthand. The compressed language of 2 people who have survived together and know each other at the level below words. He nodded once. Myung-hee turned back to Yeon-ji. "Stay for dinner," she said. "I have dweegi galbi marinating. It needs 2 more hours, but you'll wait." It was not a question. "Yes," Yeon-ji said. And in the 4th-floor apartment in Mapogu, above a street going gold with autumn, with the smell of sesame oil and pear-softened soy, and the particular warmth of a home that has been held together by one woman's hands for 31 years. Seo Yeon-ji from Heuksok-dong sat at a kitchen table and waited for dinner. For the first time in longer than she could measure, the waiting felt like something she had been invited to do rather than something she was doing on borrowed time. The fear did not arrive immediately. It waited, the way serious fears always wait, patient, structural, biding its time, until the warmth of the thing you are afraid of losing has become real enough to lose. It let her have the breakfast in Yuljiro and the gallery evening, and the dinner in Mapogu with Myung-hee's dweegi galbi, and the walks along the Cheonggyecheon when the evenings were cold enough to see their breath. It let her have the Tuesday afternoon he appeared unannounced at the community college in Dongjak, and sat in the back row of Professor On's facilities management lecture with his coat folded across his knees and afterward told her, in the stairwell, that An had been right about the staffing ratios and wrong about the linen procurement model, and the specificity of the disagreement made her laugh until she had to stop walking. It let her have all of it. And then, on a Wednesday night in November, when she was folding laundry in her 8 square meter room above the pajangmatcha, with the small heater running at its highest setting, and the rain coming down the narrow window in sheets, the fear arrived and sat down with her and began to speak. He will understand eventually, it said. He is a man who understands everything quickly. He will understand this too. She pressed a crease into the sleeve of a sweater and did not answer. The people around him are already asking questions. You have seen it. The way his assistants' eyes move when you are in the building. The way the senior directors at the second dinner spoke to you, correctly, precisely, with the specific courtesy of people who are being careful because they are uncertain what the correct category for you is, and are waiting for the category to be clarified. She set the sweater down. You are from Heuksok-dong. You live in 8 square meters. You are one missed payment away from negotiating with a landlord who doesn't ask how you are. You eat tteokbokki 4 nights a week because it is filling and costs 3,000 won. These are facts. Facts do not care about dinners in ballrooms or conversations in Yuljiro or a woman in Mapogu who noticed the pear juice in the japchae. Facts remain facts regardless of what anyone says about them in a candle-lit room. The heater clicked. The rain pressed against the window. She looked at the photograph of her mother on the desk, okay ya mid-laugh, hand raised, the rough palm, and felt the gap between that photograph and the apartment in Mapogu and the Grand Joseon ballroom as something physical, a distance measured not in kilometers but in the accumulated weight of everything that separated where she came from and where she had been sitting for the past 3 weeks. He will wake up, the fear said. They always wake up. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She picked it up again and called her mother. Okay ya answered on the second ring. The television was on in the background. She had not been asleep. Tell me, her mother said, just that. In the register she used when she already knew the shape of the thing her daughter was carrying and was ready for it. Yeon-ji sat on the edge of the mattress with the half-folded laundry beside her and said it, not elegantly, not in the composed way she normally carried herself, but in the actual way of it, the fear unedited, the arithmetic of the gap between her life and his life stated plainly, the logic of the ending she kept writing before it had been written. Okay-ya listened without interrupting. This was not always her method. She was a woman of strong and frequent opinions, but she understood when interrupting would only delay the thing her daughter needed to arrive at by speaking. When Yeon-ji finished, there was a silence. Then Okay-ya said, "Come here." "Iyama, it's almost midnight." "Then come in the morning, early, before I make breakfast." "I'm not finished with what I was trying to say." "You're finished," Okay-ya said. "You said it. Now you've said it to someone outside your own head and you can hear how it sounds." A pause. "How does it sound?" Yeon-ji looked at the window, the rain, the ventilation unit, the one visible star that may have been a satellite. "Like something I have said before," she said quietly, "about other things, that turned out not to be true." "Yes," her mother said. "Come in the morning, I'll make juk, the rice porridge not from a packet, the real kind." A breath. "Yeon-ji, you have spent your entire life writing endings before they happened because the endings you expected were always the same. You expected them because that was what the world had given you to expect." Her voice changed, became the voice she used when she was saying something she had been holding for a long time and had decided the time for holding it was over. "But that world was wrong about you from the beginning, and a man who sees things correctly is not the same as every man who couldn't." Yeon-ji pressed her palm flat against the desk beside the photograph. "I'll come in the morning," she said. "Good," her mother said, "and bring those pastries from the place on the corner, the red bean ones. I've been thinking about them all week." The confrontation with Park Jisoo happened without Yeon-ji planning it. It was a Saturday in the second week of November, in the lobby of a hotel in Sinchon, where a mutual acquaintance was holding a small industry networking event for hospitality professionals. The kind of gathering Yeon-ji attended irregularly, when the timing worked and the entrance fee was within reach, because she had learned that showing up was the primary qualification for being considered. She saw Jisoo near the entrance, speaking to a group of 3 people with the polished, projecting warmth of a woman performing her professional self at full capacity. The silk blouse, the correct shoes, the particular angle of her chin that communicated "I belong here" without requiring the statement to be made aloud. Jisoo saw her at the same moment. The calculation that crossed her face was rapid and visible, the brief rearrangement of a person deciding how to handle an encounter they had not prepared for. She chose, ultimately, the version of herself that had always worked, warmth worn like armor. "Yeon-ji," she said, with the tone of a woman greeting someone she has always wished well. "I heard the grand Joseon event went well. I'm so glad." The people around Jisoo registered the exchange with the ambient attention of a group that has just detected the charge in the air between 2 people and is deciding how closely to listen. Yeon-ji looked at her. In the school hallway at 7 years old, she had stood in the silence after "Your costume smells like the market," and she had swallowed it and walked away and performed the play perfectly and come home, and said the performance went well. In the hotel in Mapogu, she had been moved to the back, and she had said nothing and found a different placement and carried it. In the Grand Joseon, she had stood in the doorway and understood what had been done to her, and she had not turned around. She had spent 28 years becoming very good at absorbing the weight of other people's decisions about her, without requiring them to account for it. She was done. "You sent me to that room as a joke," Yeon-ji said. Her voice was even, not loud, not theatrical, the tone of someone making a plain statement about a plain fact to a person who already knows it. "You took a request from director Kwon Sang-chul to send the most unsuitable candidate in your pool to Chairman Jang's private dinner. You chose me. You told me it was a hospitality support role. You arranged it because you believed I would walk in and be humiliated, and you found that outcome entertaining." The warmth on Jisoo's face had not collapsed, but it had developed a structural problem. The kind of problem that is visible in the set of the jaw and the slight stillness that descends around the eyes when the expression being maintained is no longer connected to anything underneath it. "I don't know what you've been told, but—" "I haven't been told anything," Yeon-ji said. "I was there. I know what the room looked like when I walked in. I know what a room looks like when it has been expecting you." She paused. "I also know that you will receive a call from the Jang Hotel Group's legal office early next week regarding the circumstances of the placement. I'm telling you now because I thought you should not be surprised by it." A breath. "I was surprised by enough that evening. I didn't want to pass that on." She left Jisoo in the lobby. Her hands were not shaking, which surprised her. They had been shaking at the christening confrontation she had rehearsed in her head a dozen times and then found in the actual moment did not require rehearsal. The body, it turned out, knew how to do this. It had been waiting for permission. Outside the hotel, the November air was sharp and direct. She stood on the pavement for a moment and breathed it. Then she called Jang. He answered on the second ring. "Where are you?" "Sinchon. I just told Jisoo from Hana Staffing to expect your legal office's call." A brief silence. "I was going to inform you before that call was made." "I didn't need informing. I needed to say it myself first." She paused. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. And she could hear in the single syllable something that was not quite amusement and not quite pride, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "Are you all right?" "I'm good," she said, and meant it. "What happened with Kwon and the others?" What had happened with Kwon Sang-chul, Lee So-young, and Jung Byung-ho had happened in 2 stages. The first stage had been internal and swift. Within 72 hours of the Grand Joseon dinner, Jang Hyun-woo had reviewed the communication records between Kwon's office and Hana Staffing, with the methodical attention of a man who has spent 3 decades building an empire partly on the principle that the details people think are invisible are the ones that matter most. The phone records, the message threads, the email from Jisoo confirming the placement with a line at the bottom that read, and Jang read this line several times. In the way you read something, you are ensuring you have understood correctly. As discussed, the candidate is suitable for the purpose you described. He had read that line and set the document down and looked out the window of his office on the 23rd floor for a long moment. Then he had made 3 phone calls. The second stage was public, and it happened at the quarterly directors' meeting 4 weeks after the grand Joseon dinner, in the boardroom on the 23rd floor of the Jang Hotel Group's Gangnam headquarters, in front of 11 senior directors, and the company's legal counsel and Jang's executive assistant who had worked for him for 9 years and who later said, to the single person she trusted enough to say it to, that she had seen him angry twice before in 9 years, and that what she saw in the boardroom that morning was not anger. It was something more organized than anger. Anger is reactive. What she saw was already finished. Kwon Sang-chul sat at the table and heard himself described, accurately, in documented detail, without embellishment or rhetorical elevation, as a man who had used his position within the Jang Hotel Group to orchestrate the deliberate humiliation of a civilian job applicant for the entertainment of himself and his colleagues, in a property bearing the Jang name, at an event hosted by Jang Hyun-woo personally. Jang did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In 11 years of working for him, no one in that room had ever needed him to raise his voice to understand the exact weight of what he was saying. The Jang Hotel Group, he said near the end, was built on one principle, that the way we treat people, all people in every context at every level, is not a marketing position. It is not a value statement framed on a wall. It is the actual substance of what we are. Every decision made under this company's name is either consistent with that principle or it is a corruption of it. He looked at Kwon. What was arranged on the evening of the grand Joseon dinner was a corruption of it. Premeditated, deliberate, and executed using the resources of this company. A pause. I do not retain people who corrupt what this company is. Kwon began to speak. Jang said simply, the documentation has already been provided to legal. This is not a conversation. Director Kwon Sang-chul's resignation was processed by end of business that day. Lee So-young's followed the next morning. Yong Byung-ho, who had sent a written apology to Jang's office the evening after the dinner, the apology of a man who had understood immediately that the architecture of the joke had shifted beneath him, and had chosen the calculation of self-preservation over the solidarity of complicity, received a formal warning and a lateral transfer to the Jeju property, where he would spend the following 18 months in the particular professional purgatory of a man whose name has been noted. Park Jisoo's contract with the Jang Hotel Group as a preferred staffing agency partner was terminated the same week. Her call from the legal office came on a Tuesday, as Yeon-ji had told her it would. 3 careers ended with the quiet precision of a man for whom the ending was never the point. The point was the principle. Yeon-ji heard the full account on a Sunday evening in the kitchen of the Mapo-gu apartment, where she had begun to arrive with the regularity of someone who has been given a key, not literally, not yet, but in the way that matters more than a key. She had been given the expectation of her own arrival. Myung-hee was making sunjubu across the small kitchen. Jang was at the table across from Yeon-ji, speaking in the direct, unadorned way he communicated everything, without the editorial softening of a man who needed her to feel he was a hero of the story. He was not telling her to make her feel protected. He was telling her because she was a person who was owed the information and who he had decided, some time ago, should be told things plainly and completely. She listened, she asked 2 questions, he answered both. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at the table, the old laminate surface, The ring from a teacup that had been there long enough to be permanent. The small ceramic holder with the spoons that had been there since before she arrived and would be there after. "The three of them," she said. "Do you think they understand what they did wrong?" He considered the question. Kwon understands that he miscalculated. So Young understands that she aligned herself incorrectly. Byung-ho understands that he should have refused from the beginning. A pause. Whether any of them understand what they actually did wrong, what it cost you to stand in that doorway, what it has cost you every time a room has looked at you and decided before you spoke, I don't know. I'm not certain any of them have the apparatus for it. She looked at him. That's honest. I try to be. You succeed more than most. Across the kitchen, Myung-hee set a stone pot on the table without comment. The sunjubu was at a full boil, the egg in, the surface moving in the particular way of something still becoming itself. Yeon-ji looked at it and thought about the grand Joseon kitchen and the oversalted broth and the first dinner and the first conversation, and the drive home over the Dongjak Bridge and her mother's voice at midnight, and the sunjubu jjigi in Yuljiro, and the japchae with the Asian pear and the boardroom in Gangnam, and 3 letters of resignation and a contract termination, and the way the world sometimes, not often but sometimes, adjusts itself in the direction of what is correct. She picked up her spoon. "It needs a minute," Myung-hee said, sitting down with the authority of a woman who has been making this pronouncement at this table for 31 years. "I know," Yeon-ji said. "I can wait." Myung-hee looked at her son, the look that was private and complete, the 30 years of shorthand. He was already looking back. Outside the window, the November street was going quiet, the ginkgo trees stripped now to their bare architecture, the last gold leaves gathered in the gutters, the sky the particular dark of a city that never goes fully dark but reaches at night something that passes, in its own way, for peace. The proposal did not happen the way proposals happen in the stories people tell about proposals. There was no restaurant booked 3 weeks in advance, no ring arranged in a dessert, no choreography designed to be witnessed and retold, no moment constructed for the benefit of an audience, because Jang Hyun-woo had spent his entire adult life in rooms full of constructed moments and had developed, as a result, a constitutional aversion to anything that prioritized the appearance of meaning over the actual substance of it. It happened on a Thursday morning in January, in the kitchen of the Mapogu apartment, which had become by then a room Yeon-ji knew well enough to move through in the dark. The placement of the ceramic spoon holder, the drawer that stuck on the left side, the window latch that required a specific upward pressure before it would release, the way the morning light came through at a low angle in winter and made the laminate table surface look briefly like something more expensive than it was. Myung-hee was in Busan for the week, visiting her younger sister. The apartment had the particular quality of itself without her, the same warmth, the same accumulated evidence of a life, but quieter, the way a room is quieter when its primary occupant is absent even if that occupant was not loud. Yeon-ji was making doenjang jjigi. Not because anyone had asked her to. Because it was Thursday morning and she was there, and the refrigerator had the ingredients, and making food in a kitchen she had come to feel at home in was, she had discovered over the past several months, one of the specific forms that happiness had taken in her life when she had finally stopped being too vigilant to notice it. She was cutting the zucchini in the particular way her mother had taught her, diagonal, consistent thickness, which is not decorative but functional. It affects the cooking time. When Jang came into the kitchen from the small study where he had been working since 6:30, still in the clothes he wore for early mornings alone, which were simpler than his public clothes, and which she privately considered the more accurate version of him. He stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment. She knew he was there. She kept cutting. "Marry me," he said. She did not put down the knife. She finished the zucchini slice she was halfway through, set it with the others, and then set the knife down on the board and turned to look at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms loosely crossed, and his expression was the same it always was, composed, attentive, the controlled surface that she had learned, over months of close observation, to read at a resolution most people never got close enough to access. Underneath the composure was the thing she had first seen in the grand Joseon ballroom when he walked the length of the table toward her. Certainty. Not arrogance. Certainty is different from arrogance the way a load-bearing wall is different from decoration. It holds something up. It has a purpose beyond itself. He was certain. He had been certain for some time. He was telling her now because he had decided the time for telling her was now, not because the moment was designed, but because the moment was real, and real was the only category he trusted. She looked at him in the winter morning light of his mother's kitchen, flour from the cutting board on her hands, the doenjang starting its low simmer behind her, and she felt the full weight of the distance traveled from the doorway of the grand Joseon ballroom to this kitchen doorway, from the room that had looked at her, and decided before she spoke to this man who had looked at her, and decided something entirely different. "Your mother will say you should have done it somewhere with better lighting," she said. "My mother will say I should have done it months ago, and the lighting is irrelevant." She'd be right on both counts. She usually is. He had not moved from the doorframe. Yeon-ji. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. She turned back to the stove. He stayed in the doorway for another moment. She could feel him there, the specific quality of his presence which she had become fluent in the way you become fluent in a language that begins to think for you. And then he came into the kitchen and poured 2 cups of barley tea and set one beside her on the counter and stood with his, watching her finish the jjiggy with the focused, appreciative attention of a man who has understood that watching someone do something they are genuinely good at is one of the available forms of joy. "The zucchini," he said. "Diagonal cut, my mother's method. It's different from how my mother cuts it." "Your mother's method is also correct. They're approaching the same result from different angles." She adjusted the heat. "That's true of most things." He drank his tea. Outside, the winter street was beginning its morning. The ginkgo trees bare, the sky the low white of a Seoul January, a delivery truck moving slowly up the road with its hazard lights blinking in the cold. The ordinary machinery of a city that does not pause for anything, not for private dinners in grand ballrooms, not for women in navy dresses standing in doorways, not for proposals in kitchens on Thursday mornings, not for any of it. It simply continues. And inside it, people build their lives by hand. They married in March, when the first plum blossoms appeared in the small park at the end of the Mapogu Street, which Myung-hee had been monitoring since February with the proprietary attention of a woman who had decided the blossoms were a relevant factor in the scheduling, and whose opinion on scheduling in her own neighborhood was not open to revision. 42 people, not in the Grand Joseon, not in any of the 12 properties bearing the Jang name, a decision Jang made without announcement and which his assistant understood immediately and did not question. They married in a small hanok venue in Bukshan that had been a private home for 3 generations before the family converted it to occasional events. Low wooden beams, heated floors, paper screens that filtered the March light into something soft and indirect. The smell of old wood and the first outdoor warmth of the year coming through the open courtyard. Myung-hee organized the food. This was not a request anyone made. It was simply what happened. She arrived at the hanok at 7 in the morning with 3 women from her building and an inventory of what needed to be done, and the settled authority of someone who has been waiting for an occasion worth organizing and intends to meet it correctly. The galbi was her recipe. The japchae was made with glass noodles from the good shop and soy softened with Asian pear. The sikhai was brewed the traditional way, 3 days prior, and served cold in the small ceramic cups that had come from her own kitchen. Okaya arrived in the car that Jang had arranged, a vehicle with the specific adaptations required, space for the wheelchair, a driver who understood without being told the pace of getting someone settled. And when she came through the courtyard gate in her good hanbok, the deep blue one she had bought for Yeon-ji's middle school graduation, and had kept pressed and wrapped in the wardrobe for 15 years, waiting for an occasion proportionate to it. Yeon-ji was standing in the courtyard and saw her mother's face, and had to look at the plum blossoms for a moment until she could see clearly again. Calvin, Yeon-ji's younger brother, in this story replaced by her brother from Gangseo, Lee Jun-ho, 19 years old, and studying engineering at the university in Daejeon on a scholarship that had arrived in his acceptance letter the same week as a separate letter from the Jang Foundation's educational support program. A coincidence that Jun-ho had examined carefully, and then decided to accept on the basis that the scholarship was real, and the education was real, and the rest of it was between his sister and a man who had looked at her correctly. Jun-ho walked Yeon-ji through the courtyard with the expression of a young man performing composure over something larger than composure, his jaw set in the way that was identical to his sister's jaw when she was holding herself together by will. He did not cry. She did not look at him directly, which was how they had always managed the things between them that were too large for direct confrontation. Professor An-gi from the community college in Dongjak came with his wife and sat near the back and ate 3 servings of galbi, which Myung-hee noted with visible approval. Joseph, replaced here by the owner of the Sunjubu restaurant in Yuljiro, the grandmother who had been cooking the same stock for 41 years, and who Jang had personally invited with a handwritten note slid under the restaurant door on a Tuesday morning, sat near the front and cried openly and without embarrassment from the beginning of the ceremony to the end, and refused all offered tissues on the grounds that she had brought her own. The ceremony was short. The words were the real ones, not the performed ones. Jang said his in the quiet, carrying voice that did not require elevation to fill a room, and Yeon-ji said hers in the steady voice she had not known she possessed until a ballroom in January had required her to discover it. When it was over, Myung-hee poured the sikhai and the haraboji who ran the pajangmatcha below Yeon-ji's goshiwon, whom she had invited because he had handed her extra fish cake without charging for 4 years, and she considered this an act of sustained, unannounced kindness that deserved to be in the room, drank his cup, and said it was the best sikhai he had ever tasted, which Myung-hee received with the expression of someone who has expected this assessment, and finds its confirmation satisfying rather than surprising. Jun-ho argued with Professor An about the tensile properties of a specific aerospace polymer for 40 minutes. Ok-ya and Myung-hee sat together near the courtyard window and spoke in the low, continuous way of 2 women who have immediately recognized in each other the specific grammar of a life built without assistance, and have found in that recognition the ease of being entirely understood. Yeon-ji watched her mother and her mother-in-law from across the room, Ok-ya's hands on the table, the rough palms, the sea that never washed off, and Myung-hee's hands beside them, the extraordinary grip, the hands that had held a family together through decades of difficulty, and felt something in her chest open the way seeds open. Not painfully, not with drama, but from the inside, because something had grown too large to be contained by the structure that had held it. That evening, after the guests had gone and the hanok had been returned to its quiet, after Jun-ho had taken Ok-ya home and Myung-hee had supervised the final cleaning with the thoroughness of a woman ensuring a space is left correctly, after the plum blossoms in the courtyard had closed for the night in the way blossoms close, not gone, simply waiting, Yeon-ji stood in the small bathroom of the hanok's private room and looked at herself in the mirror. She was still in the wedding hanbok, pale gold, the color of early morning, chosen not to hide in but to be seen in, a distinction she had made consciously, and which had cost her something to make, the way all real choices cost something, because the habit of hiding is its own form of safety, and giving it up requires giving up the safety too. Her hair was coming down from its arrangement. Her eyes were slightly swollen from the crying she had done quietly during the ceremony, the kind of crying that is not grief, but the body's acknowledgement of something it has been waiting a long time to feel. Her face, in the mirror, was the face of a woman who has had a long day in the specific way that long days are long when every hour of them has mattered. She looked at herself. Not the way she had looked at herself in her mother's bathroom in Heuksok-dong before the grand Joseon dinner. The inventory, the catalog, the exhaustive and defeated familiarity of a prisoner counting walls. Not the sideways assessment of a woman bracing for the judgment of a room. Not the careful, self-minimizing look of someone trying to determine how much space they are permitted to occupy before the room objects. She looked at herself the way she looked at a finished dish, with recognition, with the specific, unglamorous respect of someone who understands what the making of something costs and what it means that the thing has been made. She was still from Heuksok-dong. She still lived above a pajangmacha in 8 square meters for 6 more weeks, until the apartment in Mapogu was ready, the 1-3 floors below Myeong-hee that Jang had owned for years and left empty because he had not until recently had a reason to fill it. She still ate tteokbokki from the Haraboji's cart when she wanted to, which was often, because it was filling and cost 3,000 won, and he gave her extra fish cake, and this was a form of love she had no intention of outgrowing. She still attended the community college course in Dongjak, which she would complete in May, and Professor An had already spoken to her about the possibility of a second-year module, and separately the Jang Hotel Group's head of operations development had sent her a formal inquiry about a trainee placement, an inquiry that had arrived through the correct institutional channels and which she was evaluating on its actual merits. She was still all of the things she had always been. She had simply stopped apologizing for the space they took up. Jang appeared in the doorway behind her, wedding shirt, top button open, sleeves rolled to the forearm in the way she recognized as his default state of partial undress, the version of him that existed when the formal architecture of the day had been set down. He looked at her reflection in the mirror with the unhurried attention she had come to understand was not a performance of attentiveness, but the actual thing, the way he moved through the world, noticing. "What do you see?" he asked. She had been asked this question before, not out loud, by every room that had ever assessed her, by every mirror she had ever stood in front of with the specific dread of a woman who has learned to expect the mirror to confirm the verdict the room has already delivered. She had answered it always with the catalog, the inventory, the defeated familiarity of walls. She considered it now. She thought about the girl in the school hallway who had delivered all 6 lines without a single mistake and walked home and said the performance went well. She thought about the woman in the navy dress who had stood in a ballroom doorway and understood what had been arranged and had not turned around. She thought about doenjang jjigae made from almost nothing, about diagonal cut zucchini, about sunjubu broth built over 2 days, about a grandmother who would not answer questions about her stock, about glass noodles from the good shop softened with Asian pear, about the extraordinary grip of a woman's hands that had answered the same question. What are you made of? Every day for 30 years without hesitation. She thought about bread, real bread, the kind with imperfections and uneven air pockets, the kind that has character, the kind that takes time and attention and heat and pressure and emerges, transformed not into something different from what it was, but into the fullest, most realized expression of what it was always going to become. Someone who is enough, she said. He held her gaze in the mirror. The March night pressed its darkness against the small window. Somewhere in the courtyard, a last petal released from a plum branch and fell without sound. "You have always been enough," he said. "The world was simply slow." She turned off the bathroom light. She walked into the room where her husband was waiting, where the heated floor was warm beneath her feet and the window showed the courtyard and the bare branches and the city's persistent, patient light beyond them, and she felt the full weight of the life she was standing inside. Not its grandeur, not its improbability, not the distance between the goshiwon and this room, but its realness, its texture. The specific, unglamorous, magnificent realness of a life, built by hand by someone who had refused, in the end, to build it small. Somewhere in Gangseo, Okeya was looking at a photograph on her phone that Junho had taken during the ceremony. Yeon-ji mid-laugh, hand half raised, the good hanbok, the courtyard light, and she was smiling with the particular expression of a woman who planted something in hard ground a long time ago and is no longer surprised that it grew, only grateful, only full. Somewhere in Yuljiro, a basement restaurant sat dark and quiet, the stock still going on the back burner the way it always went, building itself over hours into something that would be worth the wait. Somewhere in Bukshan, a small hanok held the warmth of 42 people in its walls the way old wood holds warmth. Long after the fire is out, long after the guests have gone, long after the day has ended and the new one has not yet begun. And in a room above a courtyard where the plum blossoms were opening again in the dark, a woman who had spent her whole life being measured looked at the city through the window and understood at last that she had never been too much. She had always been exactly, precisely, irrevocably right. The realness of her had not been a problem to be solved. It had been the whole point. It had been everything.